Chapter 5, of What If Natsu Was a Lightning Dragon Slayer. Make sure to subscribe for more. November 11th, year X 773. Urza Scarlet sat at the top of a hill not too far away from Rosemary Village, a contemplative expression on her face. The morning breeze caressed her face and hair with the softness of a mother's touch. 4 months had passed since Natsu's arrival into the village, and by the gods of Earthland did he change their lives. It started slow at first. Natsu was assimilating himself to village lifestyle, having lived in a cave with an enormous dragon for almost half of his life. He had commented that the difference between his cave lifestyle and the village lifestyle was like night and day. For one, it was the food they ate, and the way they ate it. In Rosemary Village, eating was more civilized, with a greater focus on manners. While he did learn manners from Raggio, there were times when he would just let go and eat as much as possible before collapsing of bloating. That usually happened after training, he said. His initial behavior concerning the kids and their families was completely opposite hers when she first met them. Granted, she was a lot younger than Natsu, but even then she could not imagine being so outgoing when it came to meeting new people. It amazed her. Whenever he wasn't training himself into the ground, he spent up to hours just lounging around with Simon, Darius and Jugo, playing whatever came into their childish minds. But, even from a distance, it was obvious that Natsu had the most mature mind out of all of them. His smile seemed genuine to all, but, living with him for 4 months now, she noticed that the smile didn't quite reach those eyes of his. His eyes told an entirely different story. They were fraught with burning pain, and nigh overwhelming loss. But, grim determination was present as well. The loss of his dragon father, Raggio, was still very present in the 9-year-old boy, no matter how much he tried to hide it. But, instead of sinking into despair as most children would, he stood up and pushed forward, wanting to become the strongest dragon slayer in the world, a promise, he once told her, that he had made to his father in his death. It concerned her. There were times when he would disappear for the entire day, not appearing until late at night, completely ragged and out of breath, as if he had fought a legion of the forest's wyverns. She wondered if he even ate while he was away. Stern reprimands he had received from Grandpa Rob, chastising him for not warning them of his training. After that, he was more forthcoming with his disappearances, letting them know where he went. He would return for lunch, before disappearing again, returning once more by dinner. Close to the 3rd month of his stay, however, he was with her almost all the time. Little Kagura was very taken with Natsu, following him like a lost puppy, pestering him to show her his awesome magic, as she called it. But, instead of growing annoyed and shooing the little purple-haired girl, he would smile brightly and show her his kick-butt moves, as he called them. It never failed to make her laugh. All of the adults had adopted Natsu as a surrogate member to their family, inviting him every now and then into their homes for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. He would graciously accept the offers, wanting to befriend everyone in the village, and have a go at their scrumptious cuisine, whatever that meant. She sometimes wondered how Natsu got so smart, and she would ask him, only to be told that he learned most of his vocabulary by reading books of gradually increasing difficulty. That was another thing that surprised her from Natsu. He didn't look like the kind of child that would sit down and read books, especially advanced ones. He seemed more like a brash, knuckle-headed idiot that would rush into things without thinking and had a limited vocabulary, not to forget an easily provoked temper. He had none of those aspects sometimes, he was the complete opposite. He was friendly, intelligent and outgoing, willing to help the villagers in anything they needed. Heck, even Darius' father, Milton, the resident recluse of Rosemary Village, fell victim to Natsu's befriending charms. Oh, yeah, he was changing lives. But, in her honest opinion, Natsu Dragio changed her life far more than anyone else's. Her training in the magical arts increased exponentially, as well as her learning. It wasn't that Grandpa Rob was a bad teacher. Oh no, it was far from that. It was because she now had someone to measure herself against and surpass in terms of overall magical prowess. Yes, Natsu Dragio had become her rival. Whenever he trained with her, she gave it her absolute best to succeed in whatever endeavors they had deigned themselves to accomplish. He worked on his lightning, she on her fire. Both worked together on requip as well, though he was mostly teaching her. By the second week of him teaching her, she had learned the ins and outs of requip. During that time, they had also discovered that she had an aptitude for telekinesis. It started out small, of course, with her moving small things, such as pebbles and paper, progressively increasing in terms of difficulty. By the third week of October, she could move an entire table with little effort. She had tried to use it in her spars with Natsu, with varying success. Sometimes she would strike him with considerable force, others he would just brush it off as if it were nothing. It completely surprised her how powerful Natsu Dragio really was. The sheer amount of lightning he would throw at her was just mind-boggling. She was no slouch in terms of raw magical energy though, much to her surprise. It turned out that she had an amazing reserve of magical energy, easily matching an S-class wizard, according to Grandpa Rob. But, when compared to Natsu's reserve, hers fell short. Grandpa Rob had called him a veritable sea of magic power, easily surpassing most of the S-class wizards in the entirety of Fiore, including himself. She still found herself disbelieving of that little fact. How he came to have so much power at his age, she couldn't explain. Grandpa Rob had attributed it to the fact that he was a dragon slayer. Due to the fact that dragon slayers were amongst the most powerful wizards in existence. It was infuriating, in a good way. No matter how hard she tried, she could not beat Natsu Dragio. He always found a way to gain the upper hand in their spars and win all of them, regardless of what she threw at him. She would not get mad, though. On the contrary, she was happy that every time they sparred, she would improve by a variable margin. They both improved considerably, with her showing the greatest progress. She ran a hand through her scarlet hair, and smiled softly. How could she not? For every time she touched or thought about her hair, she remembered that day. The day she received her last name. She was panting heavily, her hands gripping her knees rather tightly and her eyes glued to the ground. She was beginning to run low on magic power to fuel her telekinetic and fire attacks. Looking up, she saw the visage of her opponent and rival, smiling widely at her, though not in a mocking way. He, too, was breathing heavily, but it was much lighter than hers. He, too, was sweating profusely, but it paled in comparison to hers. His spiky pink hair swayed ever so slightly with the wind. He stood straight, with his arms crossed over his chest, small sparks of lightning arcing around his body. "I win," was all he said. However, it held no derision, no mocking, only happiness in both of their progress. Yet, once again, she responded breathily, with no frustration laced. "Well, let's go back. Gramps must have lunch ready for us," Natsu stated, walking towards her. "Are you okay? Can you walk?" She nodded shakily, not really sure if she could actually walk. However, at the very first step she took, she stumbled, too tired to move properly. She closed her eyes and expected pain, but it never came. Warmth spread throughout her body, originating from the anterior. She felt two hands grab her legs to prevent her from falling off. "Whoa, there. Wouldn't want you to fall now, would I?" he spoke warmly. He adjusted her position, ensuring the maximum level of comfort. "Here, let me carry you home." But, aren't you tired?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his neck, unconsciously blushing softly. "Nah, I'm still good. Still have some spark left in me," he stated, grinning toothily at her. She smiled and closed her eyes, snuggling a little closer to him. She never actually paid enough attention to Natsu's warmth. It was amazing. She couldn't explain why he was so warm. And she was supposed to be the fire mage. Hey, Urza, spoke up Natsu suddenly, snapping her out of her train of thought. Yes, Natsu, you never actually told me your last name, he said, looking back at her, curiosity burning in his onyx eyes. Her demeanor changed completely, almost as if day became night. She sighed, forlorn crossing her pretty visage. She mumbled something indiscernible, something not even Natsu's enhanced hearing could make out. I'm sorry, what did you say? He asked, hoping to get her to answer with a tad bit more volume. I don't have one, she muttered. In truth, I never knew mine, since my parents abandoned me here when I was a baby. Natsu frowned slightly. However, after a few seconds of silence, he brightened up once more. Hey, I know, he called out, surprising her slightly. How about I give you one, what? Yeah, that should work, he continued, completely ignoring her incomplete question. He furrowed his brow in deep thought. He'll give me a last name? Really? But, why, she thought, an indiscernible feeling pulling at her heart. He turned around, examining her for a few seconds, until his eyes fell on something. Then, he smiled, widely. Scarlet, he murmured. What? She asked, unable to discern what he said. Scarlet, he repeated, louder this time. She stared at him blankly for a few seconds before regaining herself. Why Scarlet? She inquired, positively curious. At this, he blushed. Natsu actually blushed. Because of your hair, he spoke, rather evasively. Why my hair? She asked, more curious than ever before. What kind of thought would have made Natsu blush like that? He actually looked rather cute. At that, she blushed prettily. Because, your hair's red, and I really like your hair, he responded, his blush intensifying, and a megawatt smile appearing on his visage. She blushed even deeper, if that was possible. In fact, her blush easily rivaled her hair color. Thanks, she mumbled, unable to think of anything else to say to him. You're welcome, he answered, regaining himself. A silence ensued, a silence that, in their minds, felt rather awkward. Natsu, shaking his head slightly, decided to break it. Well, anyways, we should go. Gramps must be worried for us, he announced before rushing in the direction of their home. On the way, she snuggled deeper into his back, her chin resting on the side of his neck. Thank you, Natsu, Erza. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the familiar voice of her rival, Natsu Dragio. She turned in the direction of his voice, seeing him running at her, a Cheshire grin on his face. She paled slightly, knowing that that particular smile usually meant that he was going to do something new in their spars. Hey, Urza, let me show you this new spell I came up with, he chirped excitedly. She smiled softly and nodded. Okay, show me, she said, standing up and facing him. All right, here goes, he exclaimed, taking a battle stance while putting his arms behind his back, reminding her of the position he took when he used his lightning dragon's bolt cannon. He charged the electricity into an orb, just like that spell. However, the concentration and size of the orb was a lot greater, already nearing the size of his torso. Lightning began to arc around the orb, another thing the other spell didn't have. However, everything changed when he compressed the orb to the size of his palm. He began to sweat slightly, arcs of lightning appearing around his body, trademark sign of his released magic power. It was obvious that the spell he created took a large amount of effort and concentration to maintain, to prevent the spell from blowing up in his face, even if he was immune to it. Dragon Slayer's Secret Art, Grand Cannon. He released the shrunken orb by throwing only one of his hands, instead of both. Then the shock came, no pun intended. Contrary to her expectation of the orb's travel speed, it shot forward, faster than the small bolts of electricity of his bolt cannon. Her eyes widened at the sheer speed contained by the concentrated orb. She expected her astonishment to stop there, but it was only the beginning. When the orb hit its target, the ground, it expanded quickly, far too quickly. It became dome-shaped, frying the affected area with an endless amount of lightning bolts. The deluge of lightning continued for what seemed like an eternity that, in reality, was about 30 seconds. Urza could not believe her eyes. The sheer power of the spell was incomprehensible. She couldn't believe that Natsu had come up with such a powerful spell, one with endless potential for destruction, not to mention improvement. She looked at Natsu in amazement, wondering if she would ever be able to surpass her rival in terms of magical prowess. However, she quickly shifted from amazement to concern when she saw him holding his knees, breathing heavily in obvious exhaustion. "So, how'd you like it?" he heaved his inquiry, barely managing to look up at her. She couldn't help but wonder just how much magic power that spell took that it left Natsu of all people looking drained like that. Her thought process was interrupted when he tried to straighten up and walk towards her. However, before he could even lift his foot, he fell forward. So drained he was that he could not even take one step. "Natsu!" Urza cried out, rushing forward and embracing Natsu, preventing his fall. His chin ended up resting on her left shoulder, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "What were you thinking? Why even think of using the spell if it was going to leave you like that?" Well, I wanted to show you," he replied in pauses. "But why?" she asked, looking at him with concern. "I wanted you to be the first to see my new spell," he replied, slightly pushing away from her and smiling at her widely. She gasped softly. "You mean you did that all for me?" she inquired, completely stupefied. "Why, because you're my best friend, Urza," he replied, the sheer emotion embellished in his tone making her gasp again and blush brightly. Just then, he fell forward, his eyes drooping to a close. Urza remained firm in her embrace, unwilling to let him touch the ground. "You big dummy," she whispered. She slowly twisted her body, letting him rest on her back. She then shifted, making sure he was as comfortable as possible. "Let's go home. Grandpa Rob will most likely be looking for us." Slowly, she made her way into the central building of Rosemary Village, earning curious and concerned looks from the villagers. Seeing the usual boisterous bundle of joy that was Natsu Dragio completely drained and unconscious was not a good sign. "Is Natsu okay?" asked Hugo's mother as they passed his house. She was currently working on the garden. "Oh, yes, he's okay, Mara. He's just tired from a new technique he was working on," she said, earning a nod and a small smile from the blonde woman. That Natsu, always working on something new. "It makes me wonder, though, does he have a limit?" she asked, seemingly rhetorically. "Well, he does," Urza replied. "I have to go, Grandpa Rob must be worried about us." "All right, dear. Take care of Natsu," Mara called out, waving as they left her behind. When Urza arrived, she was quickly met with the sight of a sitting Grandpa Rob, looking at her expectantly, an eyebrow raised in intrigue. He was rhythmically tapping his right finger on the table. However, he had a kind smile on his face, diffusing the otherwise serious atmosphere of the cottage. I sensed a vast amount of magic energy being used not too far from here, originating from Natsu. "Is there a particular reason for that?" he asked warmly, though a hint of concern was present, something that was noticed by the redhead. "Oh, Natsu was showing me this new technique he came up with," she replied, not sure if he would believe her. She was surprised to see him snort in amusement while shaking his head. "So, he finally showed you?" he asked. Urza's eyes were wide in surprise. he knew, but Natsu had said that she was the first one to. Then realization came. She wasn't the first one to know of the technique. She was the first one to see it. She stared at her surrogate grandfather in understanding, before closing them and nodding. All the while, she was smiling softly. "Well, I don't think I need to explain myself, then," she inquired, setting the pink-haired dragon slayer down on his bed. "No need to, my dear. I already know. However, do tell me of the spell." "Ever since he mentioned its conception, I've been rather curious," he said, holding his chin with his right hand. At that, she looked up at him, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's an awesome spell," she gushed, almost bouncing in her seat. He concentrated a lot of lightning into a small ball and shoots it away at a super fast speed, and then it explodes in a literal dome of lightning. "Oh, interesting indeed. And what does he call that spell?" he inquired, looking contemplatively at her. She grabbed her chin and scrunched up her pretty little face and thought, making an effort to remember the spell through all of her excitement. I think he calls it she trailed off, having a little difficulty in remembering the name of Natsu's newest secret art. Her eyes light up in remembrance. "I know. He called it Dragon Slayer's secret art, Grand Cannon," she iterated, slapping her right fist on her left palm. "Another secret art? My, that's the fourth one in his repertoire." At such a young age, he spoke in wonder, looking aimlessly in the general location of Natsu's bed. "At this rate, he'll have over 10 of those spells by the time he's 12. Yeah, was all she could say, looking at Natsu with something akin to pride. Grandpa Rob stood up. "Well, at least you've both had breakfast," he said, stretching slightly. "Why don't we go and continue your training? If Natsu keeps progressing like this, he'll leave you in the dust." She nodded happily, getting up from the table and gathering any and all stuff necessary for her training session. Noticing her surrogate grandfather walking out the door, she fancied a look at her pink-haired rival and noticed something that warmed her completely. He had a serene smile on his face. Motivated even further, she ran outside. It was the early afternoon. The training session had gone well, with Urza achieving greater control and power of a few of her spells from all of the branches of magic she currently knew. She and Grandpa Rob were making their way onto their home, wanting to make sure Natsu was okay. When they passed the front door, they were slightly shocked to find a seemingly completely re-energized Natsu reading a book on the table, a sandwich in hand. "Natsu, you're awake," she called out, happiness obvious in her voice. He looked up, apparently a little surprised at their arrival. He quickly brightened, though. "Hey Urza," he greeted in return, his mouth still a little full. "Hey, Gramps, Natsu, what did I tell you about talking with your mouth full?" he inquired, a playful chastising tone embellishing his voice. "Oh, oops, I'm sorry," the pink-haired dragon slayer apologized, rubbing the back of his head embarrassedly. Urza chuckled softly. "Always you, Natsu, always you," she muttered softly, the smile never leaving her. Natsu heard her, though. "Hey, I don't do it on purpose," he defended himself, clamping his hands on his mouth when he noticed he still had food. He turned around, pouting at them as he chewed and swallowed his food quickly. Urza and Grandpa Rob were laughing at his expense. The scene continued for a few more minutes, the two of them laughing at Natsu while he ate, with the pout still present, if ever so slightly. "Tell me, Natsu, how are you so energetic after such a draining spell?" "From what Urza told me, it really took it out of you," inquired Grandpa Rob, honestly curious as to how the Dragon Slayer was up and about. Sure, he could have chalked it up all to his abilities, but still, he wasn't going to make assumptions. "Oh, I'm still recovering, Gramps. Believe it or not, I'm still pretty drained," he replied, earning nods and raised eyebrows from both Urza and Grandpa Rob. "I see. Will you be able to train this afternoon? Or not?" The elder man continued his questionnaire. Natsu shook his head slowly. No. As Urza said, this spell really drains me, due to the large amount of concentrated magic. It's almost like my raining lightning. But, instead of bringing down lightning from above, it expands into a huge dome of lightning once it hits the target. Interesting, Natsu. I can see the dangerous potential such a spell holds. But, tell me, how many times can you use it? Grandpa Rob asked. Only 2 times a day. After that, I need a lot of rest. That's why I can't join you for training this afternoon, Natsu answered. Both the redhead girl and the gray-haired man paused slightly, their eyes unfocused as they processed what the pink-haired dragon slayer had just said. He could only use that specific spell 2 times a day. Then, that meant, you used the spell before showing me, asked Urza, a little loudly. Natsu nodded sheepishly. When? I must ask you the same thing, Natsu. I sensed the immense surge of magic power when you showed Urza. If you used it before that, when did you do it? Not to mention, where? A spell as powerful as that would be sensed throughout the village, queried Grandpa Rob, looking pointedly at Natsu. The latter rubbed the back of his head in an embarrassed fashion. How do I say this? I put up a magical sealing barrier I saw in one of your books, replied Natsu quickly, looking away embarrassedly. You did what? The elder man nearly shouted. How did you manage to erect a magical sealing barrier? Do you know just how complicated and dangerous that spell is, not to mention its considerably high cost in magic? I don't know how I did it. All I did was follow the instructions on your book on how to set it up. I didn't add anything else, honestly, said Natsu, holding his hands up in defense. Rob sighed and rubbed his forehead momentarily while Urza just stayed quiet, too surprised to even comment. Oh, all right, Natsu. I'll take that explanation. Just please don't do it again. While useful, if the formula is wrong, sealing magic could end up sealing you and the area around you in another dimension for eternity, he warned gravely. Making both kids gulp in fear and nod shakily. Both were sweating slightly. I'll be careful and next time, Gramps, promised Natsu. The old man nodded gratefully, a small smile adorning his face. Natsu, began Urza, garnering his attention. When will you be fully recovered? The pink-haired dragon slayer's brows furrowed slightly in thought. Let's see. Well, since I last used the spell this morning, I should be fully recovered by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. The redhead nodded, smiling slightly. She then grabbed his arm and dragged him away from the table and pushed him onto the bed. Well, you should rest. I can't have my rival be out for too long. I have to fight him constantly to see my progress, proclaimed Urza, pushing Natsu over to his bed, almost throwing him in. But, Urza, Natsu began his protest, only to be interrupted by the redhead. No buts, Natsu. Rest, she commanded, pushing him onto the bed. Natsu pouted, but he fell without resistance. Urza then proceeded to cover him, giggling the entire time. There, she announced, succumbing into another fit of soft laughter when he pouted further. Now, rest. Yeah, Natsu said offhandedly. I'll rest. Please wake me when dinner's ready. Will do, she replied, walking off to the kitchen, where Grandpa Rob was currently at, cooking a meal for the two. From what Natsu could smell, it was boar stew. With the delectable smell in his mind, he drifted off slowly into the realm of Morpheus. It was night. Darkness overwhelmed the majority of the forest surrounding Rosemary Village. Only a few lamps were on, providing sparse illumination. The symphony of the night played its prelude, ready to go into its full-blown concerto. However, there was a player that was off-tempo with the group. The soft, yet very clear, sound of footsteps rang throughout the forest, sometimes silencing some of the sections. Almost instantly afterward, the sections would continue playing their part as if there was no worry in the world. Milton Windstone trekked his way north of the village, an impassive expression on his face. He exuded an ominous aura, clearly visible in his dark gray eyes. Darius was asleep in his small home. Of that, he was sure. Heck, he was almost 100% positive that the entire village was asleep, especially that old geezer Rob. Ever since he had joined Rosemary Village about 5 years ago, he noticed that Rob was a powerful man. Of course, he had heard of him as well. How could he have not? Rob was an S-class wizard, after all, and one of the strongest, too. His exploits with Team Makarov were practically legendary. His prowess may have diminished with age, but he was still a very formidable foe. He would have to be eliminated first if the plan were to work properly. Once that was done, though, they would have free rein to capture every single child in the village and ship them off into the Tower of Heaven, their future, and perhaps permanent, home. The only child that would probably pose a sliver of a problem would be the redhead, Urza. Those were his thoughts 4 months ago. Now, it was completely different. The arrival of Natsu Dragio had thrown a wrench in their original plans. Before, all he had to do was take out Rob, subdue Urza, and the rest of the brats were fair game. But now, they would have to deal with Rob, an empowered Urza, and Natsu Dragio. A dragon slayer with a veritable sea of magic power capable of wiping out the village and part of the forest if it were fully released in a single blast. However, that wasn't the worst part. Oh, no. There was something else going on with the friendly pink-haired dragon slayer. He had sensed it the moment he first met the brat 4 months ago. He was pretty sure Rob sensed it too. Something foreign, something unnatural, something sinister. He spent 4 months racking his brain, searching for what could possibly give such an ominous feeling, to no avail. He just could not find the answer. It did not feel like a demon, or a dragon. Hell, it didn't even feel alive. He could not understand it. How could he sense something dead inside a living being? Then, it hit him: whatever was inside Natsu Dragio was not dead. It was alive. However, the feeling it gave screamed death and destruction in a way that he never could have imagined. He had seen horrifying things in his life as a wizard, before he had Darius and lost his wife to a dark guild. Death and destruction caused by the scores of dark wizards that plagued the beautiful lands of Fiore, not to mention acts of depravity that were not even worth mentioning. But, all of that paled in comparison with what he sensed within Natsu. Something as ungodly as that thing should not even exist. Yet, it did. Hopefully, the raiders would take his warning into consideration and proceed with the utmost caution. However, he doubted it. Knowing them, and their leader, they would foolishly ignore him, not believing that a mere child would be able to stop them. Noises could be heard in front of him. He was getting close to the camp. He wondered why they settled so close to the village, in danger of being detected by Rob. Well, if it isn't our dear friend, Milton Windstone, a derisive voice announced, silencing all the movement. How nice of you to join us, Milton. I was beginning to worry that you were not going to show. Good thing you did, right? Yes, Master Horace, replied Milton, just as derisively. Tisk, tisk. Well, Milton, any news to bring? Horace's voice asked, quickly jumping into business. You better have some, and they better be good, for the invasion is scheduled for a few minutes from now, and not a minute later. I do have news, answered Milton quickly, no hesitation present in his voice. Well, Horace prompted, stepping into view from the blackness of the forest. He was a tall, lanky middle-aged man with gaunt features. He had graying brown hair, brown eyes, and a small graying goatee accompanied by rather thick sideburns. He wore all black. There was no distinguishing where his shirt ended and where his pants began due to the darkness. He also wore a black cape with a Gothic letter Z emblazoned on the left breast. He wore a rather malicious smirk on his face, easily giving away his intentions. Everything is set up. Your traps are spaced out throughout the village, and they are correctly configured to sprout chains when either a child or a woman enters the area of effect, debriefed Milton. Special attention has been given to the village elder's house, as per your orders. Good, Horace drawled out disgustingly, sending shivers down Milton's spine. What of the dragon boy, he currently is going through magical exhaustion, having wasted an incredibly large amount of magic energy performing 2 spells, replied Milton. That much magic power wasted on 2 spells? Preposterous, the graying man exclaimed. I'm positive you sensed the immense fluctuation of magic power in the vicinity, Master Horace. I assure you, he wasted almost all of his magic power in 2 spells, reassured the village recluse. Well, even better for us. One part of the equation down makes it all the more easier for us to take the village down. Good job, Milton. You are dismissed, Horace, waving Milton off regally. The village recluse was about to warn the leader of the Zareth cultists about Natsu's hidden entity, but was interrupted. My fellow raiders, come forth, the graying man called out into the night. In a few moments' time, a multitude of people dressed in black, bearing the Gothic letter Z on their back, stepped from the darkness and kneeled before Horace. In a few minutes' time, Rosemary Village will be ours. Scores of delectable women and children will be at your disposal. Take them all, kill all of the men, and you will be rewarded handsomely. This will be our 9th successful raid. Show them no mercy, men. Rape, pillage, and destroy. Show them the might of Lord Zareth's worshippers. He delivered his chilling speech, earning roars of approval from the black-clad men. Milton could only watch in utter silence, absolutely disgusted at the way these men enjoyed those acts of depravity. Horace lifted his hand, silencing the cultists. He warned, however, leave the redhead little girl to me. It is obvious that she has a strong will, and I will enjoy breaking her in front of that old geezer and the pink-haired dragon boy. Understood, yes, Master Horace, called out the cultists in unison. He walked through the group, getting some of them to move out of his way, and faced the direction of Rosemary Village. Very well, he called out, spreading his arms widely. The cultists stood up, readying their weapons. Destroy in the name of Lord Zareth. For Zareth, they roared, rushing towards the village, bolstered by the maniacal laughter of their leader. Horace, after all had left, turned to Milton. Come, Milton. Enjoy the symphony of screams we will play tonight, he ordered languidly. With that, he followed after his minions. A few minutes passed, and a small explosion of fire rose into the sky. Screaming began to pierce the peaceful night, completely silencing the natural symphony. The siege of Rosemary Village had begun.